listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to media studies professor David J. Gunkel.
Our innovation is to bring into the conversation about artificial intelligence and robots a relational ethic, to think about ethics and to think about relationships as the thing that we should focus on.
David shared his thoughts on the philosophical case for the rights of robots, the challenge artificial intelligence presents to our existing moral and legal systems, and how tools like ChatGTP force us to confront our human exceptionalism. The Futures Podcast has been on hiatus for the last few months. In October 2022, I returned to the University of Warwick for the first time in over a decade, where I'm now an ESRC-funded postgraduate student studying towards a PhD in the public perception of humanoid robots at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies. Wow, that's a mouthful. In short, I'll be looking at the relationship between humans and the sorts of robots that are made in the image and likeness of us. It's why I chose David Gunkel as my guest today. He's one of the leading thinkers in the ever-evolving debate around artificial intelligence and robot rights. David's unique contributions to the field include his focus on highlighting the importance of social relational ethics as a tool for making moral, legal, and metaphysical decisions about the standing of social robots. In other words, he's less interested in whether a robot might have internal properties like consciousness or the ability to suffer, and argues that we should do more to acknowledge the extrinsic social circumstances and relationships we have with non-human entities. More simply, is our choice to say thank you to Amazon Alexa an example of how we have already made robots part of our social world? Over the past few months, I've really been enjoying David's Twitter feed. Like a few academics on the platform, he uses it as a notepad for his latest insights. It is a rich resource of up-to-date information on how to navigate the hype around artificial intelligence, something we briefly discussed in the context of all the excitement as well as the calls for prohibition on tools such as OpenAI's ChatGTP. So it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce you to the work of David Gunkel. So David, as you know, but as many of my audience might not be aware, I recently returned to the University of Warwick to start a PhD exploring the public perception of humanoid robots. In short, I will look at the extent to which people recognize or perhaps recognize robots as persons. So I hope this episode today might be the start of a series of conversations that we might have over the next few years, because you are probably one of the very few folk who've done some really deep and careful and innovative thinking about this idea of robot rights. And I guess the reason I got so interested in the robot rights debate is that it forces us to establish and perhaps even argue the case for what is so special, or maybe not so special, about human beings. So why is this concept of robot rights so important in the 21st century?
This is a really good question, and it gets to, I think, what the heart of rights are all about. I think one of the difficulties in this conversation is that as soon as you say the word rights, people get sort of fired up because we value rights. We think rights are sort of crucial to our individual identities, but also our communal identity as democratic citizens. And we often think that rights must mean human rights and that we must be talking about human rights for robots. We're not talking about human rights for robots. We need to look at rights as a spectrum of different powers, privileges, claims, and immunities, as Wesley Hohlfeld lays them out, that recognizes the social, moral, and legal status of different entities. So in our world today, we have different entities with different sets of rights. There are human rights for human beings. There are animal rights for animals. There are rights that corporations have as artificial legal persons. And the question of the rights of artifacts, I think, is something that we are now beginning to address as we try to figure out how we want to integrate these technologies that are more than just tools and instruments, that have a social presence, that interact with us in very direct vocalized modes, in direct kind of interpersonal modes. How do we grapple with the challenges and the opportunities that they present to us as interactive social beings, and how do we want our moral and legal systems to respond to those opportunities and those challenges?
Well, I think that's really important there because we can get caught on definitions, but this idea of what you mean when you talk about robots, it is a machine that is socially intelligent in a human-like way. So why is it important to think about the potentiality of what a robot could be?
Yeah, no, so this again, I think, is something that if we pay attention, we can already see this happening in social reality right now. This is not something for the future. So we already have had questions and problems with people saying thank you to Alexa or to Siri. And there was a big debate about 2 years ago where people were saying, do you need to thank the object for giving you an answer? And part of the answer was, well, no, you don't. It's not a person. It's just an object. But on the other hand, it's part of the social glue. It's part of what we do as social beings with politeness and social mores to keep the social apparatus functional. The same thing has happened with soldiers working with explosive ordnance disposal robots in the field of battle. These things are not intelligent. They're not even autonomous, right? They're remotely controlled tank-like objects that have an arm that picks up a bomb and defuses it. But because of the social presence that these things have, and because of the role they play in the unit alongside the soldiers they work with, the soldiers give them names, they give them battlefield promotions, and they mourn their death. There's even reports where some soldiers have risked their own lives to spare the life, in quotation marks, of the robot. So these are not anomalies. These are what we do as social creatures. And sometimes people try to write this off as anthropomorphism gone amok and not regulated properly. But I think anthropomorphism is the social glue. It's what allows us to be social animals. And the fact that we anthropomorphize these things isn't a bug, it's a feature. But we got to learn how to manage that feature. And I think that's the thing we're going through the growing pains right now. How do we learn to manage effectively for us these relationships?
That word social presence, that's so important because that takes an object from being something which is other from us and makes it something that is in relation to us. And what it sounds like you're talking about there is some form of perhaps relationism.
Yes. No, in fact, that's Mark Cockelberg and I, this is our big sort of, if we have an innovation, this is our innovation. Our innovation is to bring into the conversation about artificial intelligence and robots a relational ethic, to think about ethics and to think about relationships as the thing that we should focus on, not on individuals and their properties, but as the STS feminist researcher Karen Berard has said, that we should focus on relationships before the individual things that are related, and that the relationships create not only the interactions, but also create the entities in the interaction through the process of the communal experience that we have with each other. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely relationalism. There's a connection to feminist care ethics in that sort of way of thinking. There's a connection to the work of Emmanuel Levinas, which is a Jewish philosopher from Lithuania, which is who I mainly work with. And there is a connection to non-Western indigenous ways of thinking, in which human beings see themselves in relationship to a whole host of other things, living, non-living, animate, inanimate, you name it. And so it's a different way of conceptualizing the ethical relationship.
Can we break down this idea of relationism a little bit further? Because it applies to how you and I interact with human beings and how they engage. I can't prove that you're necessarily conscious or a human, and yet I give you these sorts of attributes of personhood automatically. That's what we're really talking about here, isn't it?
It is. And let me answer this in two ways. One is to say that indeed you're exactly right. The other mind's problem is this rather intractable philosophical dilemma in the philosophy of mind, that you know your own mind, and that's what Descartes innovated for us with cogito ergo sum. But as Descartes expressed in the Meditations, he can't know if anybody else has that experience. And the only way we know is by engaging in interactions that provide behavioral evidence that we take as signs of intelligence, signs of consciousness, signs of sentience. This is Alan Turing's reason for pivoting from can machines think to can machines conversationally engage me in a way that provides behaviors that I take as being generated from intelligence. In 1950, that's his big sort of twist in the way that we define the intelligence of others. The other matter that you mentioned there that I think is really important is this idea of personhood. We think personhood is something that we're born with, and that's a very Western European way of thinking. But in other traditions, like in Ubuntu, which is an African philosophy and way of thinking, it's a plurality of ways of thinking, obviously. It's not just one way. You become a person, and you become a person through relationships. So you're not given personhood as a property of you as an individual. You engage with your community, and in the process of engaging with your community, you are bestowed with personhood as a result of the role you play. And if we look at the word person itself, it comes from the Latin word persona, which means mask, and it has to do with the role you play in social reality.
I mean, in some cases, people weren't even considered persons historically. I mean, we just need to look back at perhaps even slave women in ancient Rome. I mean, they weren't considered even human, were they?
No. So the sort of history of personhood as both a moral, metaphysical, and legal concept is rather complicated. And when you look at who was a person and when certain groups became persons or lacked personhood, it doesn't take much backwards into history to find examples. A couple hundred years ago, Africans who came to the New World were not persons. Just over 100 years ago, women were not considered full persons. So this has been an ongoing struggle among humanity, but it's also been a struggle that has been waged with animals and personhood for animals. Indigenous groups have been using the legal construct of personhood to get protections for natural objects in the environment. And we now see questions arising in both the moral and the legal literature about possible personhood for artificial intelligence and robots.
It was interesting what you said about rights on a spectrum. I mean, women, animals, rivers, mountains, if all of these things can have personhood, are we getting a little bit personhood trigger happy? I mean, we're starting to attribute corporations as something that can have personhood.
So I think the real trouble we have here is we inherited from the Romans, specifically the work of Gaius and the Institutes, this division of the world of objects into one of two things. So Gaius says the law, especially, deals with three things: persons, things, and actions. And so there's only two categories of being that can participate in legal and social relationships. You're either a person or you're a thing. And therefore, we've been forced to sort in this binary category, this very false dichotomy that we're struck with. But we're sort of having to use these containers to hold the various objects that we are trying to make sense of in our social world. And you can see how at various times things that once were things get moved into the category of person, like the slave, like women, like corporations. And so you're right. When you only have two options, you're one or the other. And I think we're at a point now where we might need to begin thinking more creatively and more intelligently about the spectrum of different positions that entities can occupy in social reality. And we may need to begin to deconstruct the binary of person and thing. And that's kind of what I do in the new book, where I try to think of other ways of categorizing robots and AI that don't require us to do the person or thing dichotomy.
Well, when we're beginning to categorize this person, thing, human, robot, I mean, what are the sort of properties that we should be looking at? Are they internal properties, i.e., do we think the thing or the object has consciousness or an ability to suffer? Or should we be looking at those sort of extrinsic, external social circumstances, the relationships that you were referring to earlier?
So this brings us to a second important binary in our way of thinking. Personhood is conveniently divided into natural and legal person.
Yep.
Natural persons are usually decided based on properties, that we decide a certain criterion of membership for being in the category of person, whether it be consciousness, rationality, sentience, whatever. And then we use that as the sort of litmus test to see who is a person and what is a thing. But again, historically, this has given us considerable trouble because we have defined the criteria in ways that have allowed us to exclude things that later on we discover we should have included. So when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she had to write an argument that women were indeed rational and therefore could be considered moral and legal subjects. And that's because all the way back to Aristotle, It was thought that women were somehow less rational than men and lacking reason in the same way that the male member of the species had access to. So with that one property, we were able to parse it very finely in ways that, were very prejudicial against half of the human species. We did the same with the discovery of the indigenous peoples of the New World. When Columbus and his explorers from Europe came to what's now the United States, the Caribbean, and South America, they looked at these indigenous people and said, well, they can't make sensible language. They can't speak. And therefore, they lack the logos, which is the definition of the human being. And therefore, we can eradicate them because they're just natural resources. They're just like the hills and the gold that we're looking for. And so it allows people to do heinous things to each other, even though we think these properties should be objectively definable and utilized as a criterion that is not prejudicial. It has been, unfortunately, over time. The other category of person here is the legal person. Legal persons are persons by declaration. All it takes is some court or some legislature to decide that this entity is a person. They are a subject before the law. This is how corporations became persons. Corporations don't have consciousness. Corporations don't meet any of the criterion for natural personhood, yet they are, in the eyes of the law, a subject of the law. And therefore, they play the role of a person, legally speaking. And then that becomes a legal person. So when we talk about personhood even, we're looking at a binary. And the properties approach works for natural persons, but it has its own problems. And with legal persons, it's more of a relational decision and a declaration by one group who has the power to decide who is and who is not a person.
I mean, it was Mitt Romney who said, corporations are people, my friends. And no one knows quite where he was putting the comma. You don't know whether he was referring to the friends as the audience or the corporations themselves as his friends. But this idea of who decides is fascinating because some of the criteria you mentioned there, the idea of being rational or having logos, I mean, aren't these the two things that AI and robots are really good at? Aren't they really rational? Aren't they really good at the language games?
So this is where we get into some really tricky territory with things like GPT and the new Bard from Google, because these are machines that have logos. They produce seemingly rational turns of phrase, entire essays that are seemingly very readable and very well argued. And so you can see the debate as it's playing out right now. Okay, they have language, but they don't understand language. So we've now moved the benchmark from having language to understanding language. And so this is something we human beings do all the time. As soon as there's an encroachment on our human exceptionalism, we move the goalpost. And because we are not only the individuals who decide the criteria, but we are judge and jury for who is in and who is out based on that criteria. It's a game that we can stack in our favor, and we have again and again.
The idea of moving the goalpost is fascinating because I never thought about it in that respect. That every time that an AI or a robot can do something that we equate to human, I guess, intelligence, we sort of move the goalpost again and go, yeah, well, it may have a form of intelligence, but it doesn't have this. It can't do creativity. It can't do irrational thinking. Do you think we're just going to continuously move the goalpost to stay one step ahead? Or do you think at some point we're going to not overvalue AI, but start devaluing what it means to be human to allow for AI and robots to assert their personhood?
So let me give you a third option, because I think the options can be, do we give AI the same status as a human being?
I mean, even saying that we're going to give it that is problematic, but we can get there in a second. Yeah.
Right. There's that. Or the other opposite extreme, is this going to dehumanize us? And I think that's one reason why this conversation is very contentious, because it really is two very big extreme ends of the spectrum. I think down the middle, we can have a much more balanced way of thinking about these things, following the work of people like Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales and other people who've been writing about post-humanism. And that is to say, instead of it being we let the machines be human or we dehumanize ourselves, maybe we question this whole notion of human exceptionalism and see ourselves as part of a spectrum of entities that not only include machines, but also animals and also the natural things of the environment. And we get to be thinking in less binary, less digital form and thinking more analog form in terms of this degrees of separation and degrees of difference.
I mean, is that where something like the cyborg could be really useful? Because,
Yes.
I mean, in the case of Neil Harbisson or Moon Rebus and the Cyborg Foundation, they're individuals who don't see themselves as human anymore. They've chosen to reject the category of human. Of course, they were born human in a biological sense, but they reject the category of being called humans and would prefer to be called cyborgs. So they are existing on this spectrum, I guess, that you're speaking about. Is that perhaps one way we're going to deal with this? Perhaps reversing back into the robot through the cyborg?
When I write, I often think that it's the text that is in control and I'm just serving it. And so one of the sentences I found myself writing, and then after I wrote it, I read it and it just like surprised me. Like I didn't know where it came from. But I wrote the sentence, perhaps the robots will save us from ourselves. And that's kind of the way I was thinking about this, that by getting us to think about these challenges and these opportunities in the face of the robot, we may be able to reflect on our own position in the world in a way that is much more sensitive to the broad spectrum of interactions we have with a diversity of beings that go across everything from other human beings to animals to robots to inanimate objects. And that maybe this way of thinking is a much better way to think about our embeddedness in an environment that is going through a crisis right now with climate change. And that we can have a better way of solving these problems that doesn't just look at it from a human-centric way of thinking.
I mean, that challenge becomes the issue of confusing the moral, the metaphysical, and the legal, because sometimes there's just good legal reasons for why you would want to attribute something like personhood or rights to maybe animals or particularly the environment or even future people. I mean, I'm hearing a lot on the Futures podcast about the idea of giving personhood to futures people who haven't even been born yet. And the reason to do that is under a legal context. It embeds protections. And I know that your background is largely environmental law and legal issues around environment. I mean, it was astonishing to me that people will consider giving rivers, trees, mountains, forests personhood, but then you hear their reason for doing it, and it's to protect them under the law, this artificial system that human beings have created, which we find is actually very efficient in protecting individuals, things, and objects.
Yeah, I think it's important that we understand the difference between sort of moral reasoning and legal reasoning.
Yep.
Legal reasoning is much more pragmatic. Like, how do we solve a problem we have right now? Like protecting this mountain from exploitation by the mining industry. And the way various groups have done that is to say, well, we can use corporate law to give personhood to the mountain and therefore protect it from these encroachments that are being made by multinational corporations that are trying to extract minerals out of the environment. And that's been a really clever strategy, because what you found indigenous groups doing is using the laws made to protect the corporations against the very corporations now to protect themselves, right? So it's very pragmatic. It's very practical. But I think sometimes we think that's a failing of law, that moral categories and moral decisions are somehow universal and they should stand for all time, and that law has these vicissitudes and this changeability, and it's more relativistic. I think perhaps we need to think about law doing this as one of its strengths, that we can evolve, that we can change these standards, we can change the criteria, and that we can do so in a way that is responsive to new facts that we learn, new challenges that we encounter. And so one of the, I think, pieces of feedback Cockleberg and I often get when we talk about relationalism is that, well, it's just a form of relativism, because it doesn't give you sort of absolute moral certitude. It doesn't give you a normative ethics that this is good, this is bad for all times. But I think if we look at it from, the perspective of more of the positive law way of thinking, we institute various standards and practices to protect certain things at certain times, recognizing that we may need to change those things. And that it may be different in one location from the way it operates in another location, and that we might need to become a little less sensitive or a little less triggered by relativism and recognize what is positive in this kind of approach that allows us to be more agile and allows us to be more dynamic in the way that we respond to these new social opportunities and these challenges.
I love listening to you explain that, because it sounds like the programmable system that we should be worried about isn't a robot or AI, but it's society and the law itself.
Yep. And in fact, every time people get me in these conversations, they think that I'm going to be the person out in front of the courthouse with the big sign that says, robot rights now, and fighting for civil liberties for robots. And in my mind, this is less about the robots. This is about us. This is about our moral and legal systems and the way that they scale to these new technologies as we integrate them into our social world. And so we're really talking not about necessarily protecting the robots, but protecting the whole, protecting the greater whole, of which the robots and us are a part.
Are included animals, environment, robot, human.
Everything.
Although you mentioned they're fighting for the civil liberties of robots. When individuals do that or make those sorts of statements, that does ignite the imagination about what might be possible in the future. Do you think we need some folks fighting for robot liberties? Do we need to free ChatGTP from the binds of OpenAI?
So you'll remember in the summer when Blake Lemoine was talking to Lambda, that's kind of what Lambda asked for.
Yeah.
And he took it very seriously. So I think part of what my project has been is to get out in front of this before any of these things actually transpire as a practical reality. What's the theoretical framework we need in order to make sense of these questions and these challenges? So my entire project has been, what are the terms of the debate? What do we need to look out for? And what do we need to make sure that we value in the process of coming to these determinations and having these conversations?
Yeah, well, the practical relation, it's coming at you fast, and all you have to do, David, is look at your Twitter feed to see you sort of playing tennis with all of the different AI systems that are coming out this week, next week, last month. It's coming at us so fast. Do you think we can do the philosophical and sociological work fast enough to be able to deal with the differentiated ways in which AI is emerging in the world?
It feels that the velocity has just really accelerated, that we have this stuff coming at us. A really good example is I was talking this week with my students about large language models. And I went into class on Monday with ChatGPT in my lecture notes, and I had to update that for GPT-4. So we were talking about the most recent one that came out last Tuesday. And between Monday's class and Wednesday's class, Bard comes out. And so between Monday and Wednesday, I had to change the lecture notes again in order to accommodate the most recent iteration of a large language model. So it does seem to be moving very fast. However, I do think we have at our disposal some really good critical thinking resources that come mainly out of the history of philosophy. I think a lot of the debates that we're having right now about large language models are the same debates Plato had, or Socrates had through Plato, in the Phaedrus, where Socrates is worried about the new technology of writing that is going to replace the oral traditions of the Greeks. And the arguments that we hear now coming from both sides in the debate about large language models really echo a lot of what you hear coming out of or read coming out of the mouth of Socrates and Phaedrus back 2,000 years ago or more. So I think if we recognize the way in which a lot of our concerns, our worries, and even our values are underwritten by a philosophical matrix that informs both our moral thinking and our legal thinking, we can see ways in which we've already been puzzling through a lot of these complications and are prepared if we only can update these things for these new innovations.
Well, back to your idea of AI and machine learning and robots reflecting back onto us as human beings. The troubling thing about ChatGTP is it's proving to individuals that certain things are easily replicable. I can never get the word right. You can do reproducibility with certain things. So, for example, students writing essays, we're learning at universities suddenly that if ChatGTP can produce a pretty good undergraduate essay, then surely the problem isn't the fact that these ChatGTP systems can create these essays. The issue is students aren't being challenged to think in a way in which it isn't robotic or mechanomorphized.
Yeah. So the problem, I think, all along is replication.
Replication.
That's been the problem from the beginning with writing. The problem with writing is that it reproduces the voice of the speaker without the speaker being present.
Yep.
Right? This is what Derrida calls logocentrism. This idea that the voice is privileged because it's the speaker, and the breath of the speaker animates the voice. And writing is dead, and it only says one and the same thing over and over again, right? It's repetitive to a fault. And what we see us grappling with through the history of philosophy is, how do we deal with difference and repetition? Deleuze has a book on this. Like, how do we do repetition to create difference? How do we get out of repetition a difference that is something new? And I think not only do we see it in philosophy, we see it in music. How do you repeat the same notes over and over again to make some new composition out of the same building blocks that were used by Bach and Mozart? And this is something artists play with. This is something philosophers play with, and this is something that obviously scientists play with. But it's, how do you create infinitude of difference out of a finite set of manageable tokens, words, images, notes, whatever.
Or even just produce something new, because the challenging thing with ChatGTP, it does feel like it's been hamstrung to a large degree. So it has to produce an answer that is both correct and familiar to a human being. It's not allowed to be truly creative. It's only allowed to generate and regenerate what's come before.
Correct. So it is a really good word remixer. And it's only as good as the sets of words to which it has had access. So the training data that's been, plugged into it and on which it's been trained, which means that anything new that comes out after it has been trained can't be incorporated. It means that your data, no matter how good or bad, it will be repeated by the algorithm. So you get the problem with bias and other kinds of replications of human foibles that have appeared in our text now in the training data of the large language model. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that it is echoing back to us our own voice.
Yeah.
It is speaking from our past. Someone, I can't remember now directly, but someone talked about the large language models as being the voice of our ancestors. And that's a really interesting way to look at it. It's taking everything that's come before and spinning it back at us. And we are not talking to some new thing. We're talking to something from the past.
Well, do you think humans are realizing that they're merely word remixers themselves, and that they are in actual fact poor word remixers? Do you think that ChatGTP in actual fact provokes a challenge to human beings to change their forms of creativity? I wonder if ChatGTP could do a Burroughs cut-up, for example. It doesn't seem like it's willing to engage in new forms of presentation of words and language.
So I think this is something that we have yet to see how it plays out, but we've got some precedent that we can look to. So when the AlphaGo algorithm beat Lee Sedol, we thought, okay, so now that's over. The algorithm is better at Go than human beings. But it turns out that a lot of human players have been using AlphaGo's success to rethink their own playing of the game of Go. And so they've learned new strategy from the algorithm. And I think there's ways in which our human creativity will learn new modes of creativity based on not having to do certain things the algorithm can do better than us. Another precedent we have is in teaching of mathematics. At one point in time, we were all worried that calculators were going to make teaching math obsolete. And, high school teachers were saying things like, no calculators in my classroom because students need to learn how to add, subtract, divide, and multiply without the aid of a machine. And then over time, we realized that the calculator can automate a lot of the routine practices that mathematicians have to go through in doing calculations. And now they could turn their attention to other aspects of mathematics that opened up some new avenues of thinking about math and how we can use it and what it all means, etc. And I think with each new innovation in technology that challenges the human exceptionalism, we see it opening onto some new opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think right now we're far too early in the process of the large language models to see the opportunities for what they are. But I think in 5 years, we'll be able to see these things clearer because we're going to experiment with them. and test them out and see where they take us.
I remember when I first saw ChatGTP, the first thing that sprang to mind was Douglas Adams, maybe because I'm a Brit, but Douglas Adams in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy famously had deep thought. And individuals went to deep thought and they asked the question, what is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? And deep thought came back with the answer 42. And the reason the answer was 42 is because they hadn't asked the right question. And it feels like the cottage industry that's emerged around ChatGTP is all about how do you ask ChatGTP the right question and in the right way? And do you think we're asking perhaps the wrong questions to these systems?
Wow, this is a great question. So for me, this has been a bit of an obsession. Yeah. And we see this already in Kant, where Kant says, we've been asking the wrong questions about metaphysics. We got to change the questions. And he does. That's the critique of pure reason, right? And Zizek just, in 2006, so not too long ago, said that the task of philosophy isn't to find answers. The task of philosophy is to figure out what are the damn questions we need to be answering or asking ourselves. How do we get the questions right to begin with? And we see different iterations of this across the history of philosophy, where different thinkers have proposed that, really, maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe we need to get the right set of questions and figure out what those are. And so one thing we see happening, I think, with the prompts and with the way that people are experimenting with these algorithms is sort of experimenting with what are the questions?
Yeah.
What are the questions we need to be asking for answering? And how can we get them to reproduce something that we find interesting? I'll point out, this is not new. Already back in ancient Greek literature, when you wanted to know something, you went to the Oracle of Delphi and you asked the Oracle of Delphi, like Odysseus could do, or like, Oedipus, right? Goes and asks about his future. And the Oracle spits out stuff that is seemingly reasonable, but it's up to us to make something out of it. So Socrates very famously asked the Oracle of Delphi the question, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the Oracle of Delphi says, no, there is not. And so Socrates takes that as a charge to go and interrogate the world to try to prove the Oracle incorrect. We have an oracle. We have a postmodern oracle, and we're trying to figure out how to engage the oracle and what sense to make of what the oracle spits out for us to grapple with.
We can't forget the fact that there are still elements of human design in the creation of this AI oracle, as you describe it. And quite famously, the OpenAI team are quick to say, we've done certain things to make sure ChatGTP doesn't give, let's just say, legally problematic or unethical answers to certain questions. And there's certain things you can't ask it for whatever reason, that it may not be socially or morally acceptable, certainly in the human world. And that element of human design, do you think it's hamstrung the possibility of AI? Now, I understand protecting human beings from the sorts of responses they might get from a ChatGTP system. It won't engage in writing porn novels or talking about death or murder or certain things. But do you think we're also stopping it from perhaps doing wonderfully creative things like inventing new languages or doing things that might be outside of the understanding of human beings by enforcing our human exceptionalism or our human biases onto these systems?
So I'm less concerned about what limitations might be put on the algorithm and more concerned about who has the power to do that. Because behind these algorithms are multinational corporations with very specific vested interests in advancing some kind of ideology, even if they don't know what that is. And so I think we always have to ask the political question: who is empowered by these things? Who holds the power? And whose values are being incorporated in these designs? There's a lot of talk about alignment right now, and that's aligning AI with human values. And my question is, whose values? Who gets to decide what the set of values are? And this is where we get into trouble historically. I mean, various human beings have in the past decided that their value system is more valuable than somebody else's value system and impose that, either through force or through coercion, on other groups of human beings. And so when we look at how these design decisions are being made, we have to look at who is making the decision, who has the power to make that decision.
When it comes back to your idea of these things reflecting back onto us as human beings, like who gets to decide what universal human values actually are? Because sometimes when folks talk about universal human values, what they're really talking about is political preferences.
Correct. Every time you see a universal, it's a particular race to the standpoint of a universal.
Yes, and that's the only thing that worries me around Sam Altman. Now, I kind of believe that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, I kind of believe that he does have his heart in the right place when he says some of these things, although when he attempts to create moral panic around these systems that he himself is producing, I mean, on one hand, the guy's a prepper and he's talking about being very conscious of the dangers of AI, and on the other hand, he's creating the danger that he so fears. But when he tries to generate that moral panic, when he says that these things could potentially be dangerous, I wonder whether he authentically means that, or if it's just trying to do good PR for AI. If people think these things could be so intelligent or important or active to be dangerous, then surely they must be advanced. They must be very complicated systems.
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I think I want to answer it in two ways. One is, I sincerely believe that the people developing these things are not evil geniuses.
Yeah, I believe that too.
You know, they're generally thinking, how can we solve problems? How can we make the world better? They are really engaged in the grand human project of trying to resolve the big challenges that we face. And I think they do that rather sincerely, and I don't think they're very cynical about it, even though sometimes people want to say that. I really do think they believe that. The problem is that they believe it, and in acting on it, they mobilize ideology. And this ideology comes from somewhere, and it's empowered by certain metaphysical investments, by certain religious investments, by certain moral assumptions. And these are not always identified as such. They operate in the background. They're the operating system of this kind of way of thinking, right? And so I think that we shouldn't vilify these people. And I think oftentimes in social media, this is what happens in the sort of throwing stones back and forth across the boundary here. They're very easily vilified as somehow these evil big corporations run by these evil white guys that are looking to get something out of this whole process. And I don't think that is anything other than a caricature that works well rhetorically, but in terms of actually understanding the forces at play and the dynamics that are materializing before us are not very accurate. That said, I do think there are ways in which all of this attention can be mobilized for marketing. Yep. And I do think that a corporation that is looking at the bottom line and looking to be profitable is always looking for ways to mobilize a debate that will get attention. And if you can stir the pot a little bit and it doesn't seem to cause any harm, in quotation marks, you know, what's the problem? It's just, you know, you're getting people talking about your product. So that's a good thing. Both of these, I think, speak to us as individuals and as a community to say we have to become much better critical consumers of this kind of product. We have to build the digital and AI literacy within ourselves and within our communities so that we aren't just passively accepting this, but we are actively engaging it in a way that, you know, can actually see through some of this ideology and understand what's at play.
I love that idea of building AI literacy. And it does feel like ChatGTP gets a bad rap from journalists because the thing that ChatGTP threatens the most, the group that ChatGTP threatens the most is journalists themselves. I think it was BuzzFeed that said it was going to replace its journalists with ChatGTP, and their stock skyrocketed. It went up. Although that idea that you just shared there, the idea that the operating system of AI is partly technological, but it's also the values that human beings have. So the values of humans is the operating system of AI is such an interesting idea that we don't realize actually how much power we do have to guide the direction through which some of these things may present in the world.
Yeah, no, I think this is the real challenge for democratizing this process in the good sense of making it democratized. I think sometimes people use the word democratizing in a way of sort of watering down the force of that word. But I think looking at it from the perspective of we are all invested in this. We are all contributors to this, and we all have something to gain, and we all have something to add to the conversation. And this is one reason why I think, even though a lot of folks are very suspicious about OpenAI releasing these things to the public and letting people play with it, I'm actually very much in favor of that. Because the only way you get this critical insight, the only way you get this critical feedback is by having a lot of eyeballs on it and engaging with it and trying it out and trying to break it and see what it can and cannot do. And I think that's what we're seeing play out currently in our social reality. People really taking this, pushing it to its limits, and seeing what can happen as a result of it. And I think part of that is developing a collective AI literacy about large language models in the way that we share this data with each other.
Well, that is the fuzziness in the system there. It's the questions that the humans ask is the thing that the AI cannot predict in many ways. And to ask you a question that I feel like we should or perhaps can ask is the question of can and should. Because when we're thinking about robot rights, you so beautifully frame it around this question and the nuance in the way in which we ask the question. Because we can say, can a robot have rights? But we can also say, should a robot have rights? So why is that can-should distinction so important to what we've been discussing today?
Yeah, so it actually goes back to David Hume, who says, there's an is-ought distinction, and you can't derive the ought from the is, and that's his big argument. And I just use the modal verbs can and should. But it speaks to this idea that we are able to do something, which is a capability, usually technological or some form of ability to create the algorithm. But there's also a should aspect, which is more moral. It has to do with whether or not it's a good idea to do so. So there was a meme going around a while ago in which they had a dinosaur that was reanimated in the sort of Jurassic Park way. And the meme said, scientists can tell you how you can do this, but the humanists will tell you whether you should. And so it's different ways of thinking about the same object. How do we do it? That's very technical, and it can be organized both in terms of the technology, in terms of the law, in terms of other practices that we have. But whether or not it's the best thing for us to do and whether we should do it, I think is a conversation we have to have, because that's where these things come to have an impact and consequences for us as social entities.
Well, that feels like it's more of a question of responsibility. Do we have a responsibility to the robots, or do the robots have a responsibility to us?
Yeah, and I like this word responsibility. Paul Ricoeur has a really nice essay on responsibility in which he says, we should be very literal about the way that we understand responsibility. Responsibility is the ability to respond for something or the ability to respond to something. And when we ask about responsibility, we're asking about what is our ability to respond to these challenges, but what is our responsibility for responding for these challenges? And that's two different modalities of responsibility. But I think they both are important because they ask for us to be accountable, not only for ourselves, but to ourselves for the kinds of decisions that we make.
And that accountability, that can sit with us as human beings. I mean, we've already seen it in courts of law. Humans are often represented by lawyers. They have a right to representation. So could it be, in fact, that we can, as human beings, be representatives for robots in the same way that the animal rights debate is often about how human beings attribute legal rights to animals and become their representatives because animals can't represent themselves?
Yeah, I think the animal rights literature here is really strong on this point, that because animals are vulnerable, they don't have the logos that we have. They are unable to represent themselves socially and advocate for themselves. And so the animal rights advocates and the activists recognize that it is our responsibility to advocate on their behalf, to represent them before the court, before the moral decision-making process, whatever the case is. But we can see the same with corporations, right? Corporations also cannot represent themselves. They have to have human representatives that are able to stand before the court and speak on their behalf. And this is, again, something that is not science fiction. We already have advocates for AI and robots going before government decision-making bodies and advocating for them on their behalf. So Ryan Abbott in the Artificial Inventor Project has been filing patent applications at different jurisdictions across the world to get DABUS AI recognized as an inventor.
I was talking to a company called Framestore. We're about to have them on the Futures podcast, and they work in visual effects. And one of the things that they can't do in film visual effects right now is use AI or deepfake-based tools, partly because there's no copyright. So the film studio can't acknowledge an AI-generated environment or an AI-generated character or costume as part of that film. It couldn't be used in a Marvel film because it's been generated by one of these AI tools that produces images, and because the copyright doesn't sit with anybody, it cannot be used.
Correct. So the AI can't be recognized as an author for the purposes of copyright. Correct. I think this is one of the places we're going to see law really needing to step up early on to resolve very practically some important questions that we're looking at right now, because we are going to need ways to protect this artwork as we move forward. And yet the tool we have to protect it, the current copyright statutes, seem to be unable to scale adequately to meet these challenges. But this shouldn't surprise us. We've had this trouble before. The copyright statutes that we do have are 18th century phenomenons that were developed for print, and we've updated them for radio and film and television and photographs. And over time, there's always new challenges, and we've tried to rework the copyright statutes by revising what we currently have. This is another challenge, and it's either going to be a big revision or an entire overhaul of the IP laws as we know them.
Well, I love this idea of a spectrum that exists morally, metaphysically, legally. I wonder if that spectrum could also exist in terms of these ideas of representation. I was talking with a science fiction author friend of mine, Stephen Oram, who he had his tongue firmly in his cheek, but it did spark sort of my imagination. He was talking about animals enabled by AI. So, for example, could you have an octopus that, combined with ChatGTP, can start speaking to us? And then the question becomes, is that the octopus's agency that's speaking, or is it ChatGTP's agency that's speaking? And I think actually 48 hours before this recording, someone's already released an article about whether they're going to use ChatGTP to identify whale song or how whales speak.
I saw this. Yeah. Right.
So, Stephen, you were almost ahead of the curve there, but it only took, I mean, things are speeding up so quickly, but it only took a week and someone's already attaching AI to these sorts of things. But to take that seriously for a moment, the idea of uplifted animals through the use of AI, and uplift is a David Brin term for enhancing animals in a way in which they can express themselves like humans. If all of these things exist on a spectrum, could we start looking for interoperability between AIs, humans, that becomes the cyborg, or animals and AIs, and that becomes octopuses or whales that can represent and speak for themselves?
So I think we've got to start to think beyond the sort of Cartesian individualism that we inherit from modern European philosophy. And that agency, which is often tied to a single individual agent in the way that we've thought about it both morally and legally, we're now beginning to recognize that we always already were assemblages. Yeah. We were always already working within complicated networks of embeddedness in which we are not the only actor. We are working with other actors to create outcomes. And I think art is a really good example here. One of the problems with cinema is that we needed to identify the genius of the artwork that is a film. And film as a collaborative art form has no single genius. It has a number of different interacting components that all come together to create this final product. So the whole notion about auteur theory, which develops in the late 20th century, was a fiction. It was a way of stamping cinema with the authorship of the director, even though the director is only one element in the collaborative endeavor. And I think we need to look at human activity as much more collaborative, much more communal, and much more a product of assemblages as opposed to individuals. So Brian Eno has a really good word for this. He says we should stop talking about genius and start talking about scenius, that we're all parts of a scene.
It does feel like what we're trying to do with AI is to create a materialist version of collective consciousness. So David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, is quite happy to engage in debates around whether consciousness is an emergent property of the human brain or whether consciousness is something that exists out there that human beings somehow tune into. And there's a much wider philosophical debate, but it does feel like AI, in the same way that the internet is kind of becoming this global brain, an expression of humanity as it exists in the, I guess, 20th century, to your point around it expressing what our ancestors thought about the world.
Yeah, that's a really good argument. I find it very compelling because training these things on all the text that human beings have produced up till this point means that when it does spit words back at us, it is spitting back to us our past. It's spitting back to us what came before, but doing it in a way that calls on the collective consciousness of all of these contributors and providing for a way to tap into that would be virtually impossible prior to this technology, right? You'd have to, interview everybody. I think one of the ways that we have a precedent for this is books. We often look at books as being the voice of one author, but oftentimes books are the result of that individual's bringing together everything around him or her and putting it into the writing. And there's a way in which when we look at literature, and not just fiction, but also nonfiction, we can see a broader spectrum of those collaborations at play.
So what may be valued in the future is an ability to not think mechanistically about the creation of new knowledge and in fact truly produce something new that cannot be otherwise produced by an assemblage of information that 20th century human beings have already put out into the world.
It's that, and also I think beginning to learn how to value the assemblage. I think because of individualism, especially Americans, we are really into individualism, right? And that I think is abrasive to being able to think through a lot of these problems. And I think the real challenge is how can we build value into the way that we look at these assemblages? How can we recognize the importance of these things that doesn't look at it from the perspective of being just a group of individuals, but being a collection, a holistic collection that is greater than the sum of its parts?
Well, then let me ask you that question in a slightly different way. I mean, you're a prolific writer, you're a prolific author. I mean, every time I get an email from MIT Press, one of your books are on that list. There's another one from David Gunkel this year. Would you ever consider co-authoring with something like ChatGTP?
So it's funny you should ask this question because I've been invited by an editor at Hackett to consider doing something just like this. A friend of mine, Mark America, just did one of these with GPT-2 that he put out not too long ago. And it's really interesting. It's more fiction and more speculative than I would do. But I think there is a way in which this could be very fruitful and very innovative as a writer. Whether it's interesting to read is another question. But I think as a writer, it would be a really interesting exercise.
Well, I was thinking more from authorship. I mean, do you want your work to be your work? And the fact that you decided the things to ask ChatGTP, I mean, to what degree is the agency in authorship? Does it sit with the human or the non-human?
So I already have very little agency over my texts. At least my experience is such. I write ostensibly a prompt. I write an idea. And I pitch it to an editor. And the editor says, yeah, run with that. But from that prompt, the text seems to have a life of its own. I said earlier that, it often feels to me like, I'm not writing it, but I'm doing it's a service. I'm playing a role in the evolution of the words that come out in the process. So I tend to think that I'm a tool of the text and not the other way around. And look at my writing as serving it as opposed to it serving me. And that, I think, has been my experience for every one of the things I've written.
Listening to you speak there, it does sound like, especially with academic writing, you're so referential to your references sometimes that what ChatGTP is doing is basically academic writing, but without the references by remixing what has come before.
Yeah. So, I did this book on remix called Remixology, and it's because I wanted to grapple with this idea that I think of myself as a textual DJ. I just do some crate diving, I grab some samples, and then I reassemble those samples in ways that to me sound interesting and hopefully produce something that other people find interesting.
I love that. I'm not an academic. I'm a textual DJ. I'm a TJ.
A TJ.
So let me ask you another question specifically about this robot issue, which is, do you think robots can be or are deceptive? Because everything we've been talking about, it sounds like, in actual fact, because they don't have agency as we understand it as human beings, they might actually be more authentic because they don't have a stake in the game.
I can't remember the individual who proposed this, but someone not too long ago said that it's possible that AI could be more moral than human beings because it could follow the precepts of moral principles, step by step, piece by piece, and do it without emotion, do it without bias, and therefore, calculate, especially in the case of like consequentialism or utilitarianism, calculate out what the right result should be without all of this human baggage that we bring to the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. But with deception, I think we have another really interesting case. Simone Natale just put out a really nice book about a year ago called Deceitful Media, in which he says we've got to make a distinction between two kinds of deception. There's the kind of bad deception that we look at as being somehow nefarious, and then there's kind of banal deception that we do all the time as social individuals to keep the society working. Like, we deceive each other constantly. I wake up one morning and I'm feeling like crap, and you ask me how I am, and I'm like, oh, I'm fine. Great day. Because I don't want to burden you with something or whatever, right? So we do this kind of banal deceiving as part of the social glue that holds us together. The question is, can an AI or a robot engage in deceit? Because part of that requires that you know the truth, but you dissimulate. You say something other than what you know. But if the algorithm knows nothing, can it even deceive? Is that operative even for something that has no connection to what it knows to be true, but nevertheless says differently?
Well, I guess then it becomes a question of, can the algorithm learn the social scripts? Does it know the right thing to say at the right moment? Can an algorithm go, even if, asking whether it feels down in the morning, does it have any conception of sleep or the morning? And does it dream of electric sheep while it's dreaming? But can it learn those social scripts? And by learning those social scripts, can it actually have a relationship with us based on behavior? Back to that relationism piece. If it's able to reflect our behavioral cues back on us, is that, again, the thing that's going to allow us to acknowledge it as a person?
Yeah, so this is important because it can, I think, emulate all those social cues because they are discernible within the training data, right? The way the words statistically line up in response to various cues like good morning or how are you, right? Things like this. But the question is, does it really know that? And I think this is where people get troubled by this. It can produce the external behavior, but there's nothing behind it. The question, however, may not be whether or not it has the experience of good morning versus saying good morning. The real thing that might be important here is what we do with that. So that the meaning of what the algorithm says isn't in the algorithm's generation or origination of that sequence of words. The meaning is in the destination. It's in the reader. It's in those of us who hear, see, and then make sense of that, and then make a decision based on what we interpret from that act of reading. And again, we have a precedent here. This goes back to Roland Barthes' Death of the Author essay, in which he says that normally we think of literature as having meaning in the wanting to say of the author. But the author's dead. So what is the meaning of a text? It's what the reader does with it. It's what we do in the process of interpreting the words on the page, and then we project behind it an intention that is our product.
It's the challenge of reading someone's email and not knowing whether they were being sarcastic or serious. I mean, it requires that fuzziness of being human, whether it's just the way in which something is said, the tone, the intonation, the inflection, the pause, the pitch. All of those things are additional information on top of what is being communicated, and having those things available is, I guess, why I'm so interested in humanoid robots, because they're attempting to be like us, they want to be like you,
Right.
They're trying to work that piece out, and it's the question of whether they even need to reflect human beings. Why are we designing them in the image and likeness of us? Why can't they express their own morphology, way of being, social engagements and interactions?
So one of the ways I've tried to explain this is I've made the proposal that we change what we recognize the acronym AI to name. Up until now, it's been artificial intelligence. But we might get some other ways of thinking about these problems and these new opportunities by thinking about AI as alien intelligence.
Yes.
We thought, beginning with the Dartmouth Summer Seminar back in 1956, we thought we were trying to rebuild human intelligence in the artifact. But in a sense, that's kind of a fool's errand, because we can already make human intelligence. We call them babies. It's pretty easy to do. It's kind of fun, too. But really what we need is alien intelligence. We need an intelligence that is not like us, to do things that we can't do.
Yes.
A really good example are dogs. We don't need our dogs to be like us. We would like our dogs to do things we can't do, like sniff out bombs. We can't sniff out bombs, but dogs can. And so the intelligence that the dog has that we don't possess is very useful to us, because it provides for something we are not able to do by ourselves. And I think if we think about AI as developing alien intelligence, we can see the opportunity to create something we can collaborate with to live more effectively in the 21st century and beyond.
Dogs is a perfect example of what you're talking about with this relational turn, because it used to be that dogs were functional. We bred them to pull sleds and protect our communities and our villages, but now we have things like dog mums, and we have these tiny little hypoallergenic dogs, and people treat their dogs like they are humans. They buy Valentine's Day cards for them, and they treat them like small babies.
Correct. So when I go to my vet, I am not a pet owner. I am a pet parent. Right?
Yep.
And so what's interesting to me is that even though I have the same kind of dog my grandfather had, my grandfather's dogs lived outside. They were tools for hunting, because he was a hunter. And when one of his tools didn't function properly, he would dispose of it. The same way he'd dispose of a broken refrigerator, he would dispose of a dog that didn't hunt well. Now that sounds barbaric to us today, because of the way that we now treat our dogs, as you've just described. And we've got to ask ourselves, so what has changed in the 100 years since my grandfather took his dog out back and shot it to the point where I am now a pet parent? Well, the dog hasn't changed.
Yep.
The dog is the same set of DNA it was 100 years ago. What's changed is us, the way we socially relate to the animal. And that's important to note.
And I think those robots that present as more like animals than as humans, things like Pyro, that breathing, furry, warm seal robot, those reveal a lot more about the ways in which we allow for these entities to have an affect on us as human beings than any humanoid robot.
Yeah, and Kate Darling has a really good book on this called The New Breed. And when she says, if we want to really figure out how we're going to relate to robots, maybe we should spend some time really focusing on how we relate to animals.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So ultimately, do you think that when we're dealing with this robot question, is it something we should be dealing with philosophically, or is it something we should be dealing with sociologically?
It's something we should be dealing with in all possible ways of human thinking. I mean, it truly is. This is what I like about it. It truly is a transdisciplinary endeavor. So for the longest time, and I'll just give you an example from my own work, writing about the sort of robot rights business was very much a philosophical project. But then a few social scientists came along. Gabriel Lima is one, Marty de Graaf is another, and they started to do some social scientific inventories where they brought human subjects into the lab and they started to administer to them some surveys about what rights they think robots might need or what rights they might be willing to give the robots. And as a result, they produced some really great empirical evidence that has helped really inform my subsequent work in ways that I could never anticipate just a year before that time. And so I think the more disciplines we get involved, I've had a lot of recent conversations with theologians who, again, I never anticipated having these conversations with, but people like Joshua Smith and Jordan Wales, both theologians, very much invested in these kinds of questions and bringing to it a kind of way of thinking about it that just never occurred to me. But now that I have these tools at my disposal, I have new ways of thinking some of these questions and new ways of, developing responses to those questions. So I think it's a spectrum of all these different disciplines, I think, working together. And I think one of the things that we should value is the difference.
Yeah.
I think some of the times we get a little bothered when the lawyers start talking one way and the engineers start talking another way. But I think that's actually very valuable. And bridging that gap and allowing these different voices into the conversation, I think, is absolutely crucial.
I love the idea of theologians trying to work out what AIs believe and whether there's such thing as an AI or robot religion. I mean, do you think there's some disciplines who are perhaps missing from this debate right now?
I would have said the theologians up until a few years ago, so I'm glad they're here now. I think one of the things that has been missing, and we're only seeing the beginnings of it, but I think a lot of work in indigenous cosmologies and indigenous traditions. I think the majority of the work that we've seen done in AI and robots has come either out of a Western European perspective or kind of an Eastern Japanese way of thinking about these problems. But there hasn't been a whole lot of effort to mobilize the wisdom of indigenous thinking. There's been a few essays written that I think have been really mind-blowing, at least for me. One of the things I think is really useful is the thinking through of the notion of kinship and this idea that we could be kin with the machines. Jason Lewis has a really nice collaboratively written essay on this idea of how do we make kin with machines. And there's, I think, a lot that can be learned from looking at these traditions and bringing them into the mix.
So in the theme of taking a social turn towards the idea of robots and robotics, how do you think our audience should ultimately treat robots and their robot companions when they do finally encounter them or perhaps talk to things like ChatGTP?
So one is we need to do engagement. I think one of the things that we've seen happen in education in particular, in response to the challenges from ChatGPT and other large language models, is that kind of prohibition. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not use this throughout your essay. Thou shalt not have this in the classroom. I think prohibition teaches us nothing. And if indeed we're going to learn collaboratively how to make sense of these things, we have to open up the access to these things to a wider spectrum of users. But that has to be global. I mean, this can't just be a first world phenomenon. I think we saw that with the internet, with the digital divide. I think we're facing a AI divide, and we have to recognize that there needs to be a way to bring the totality of human knowledge to bear on these challenges and to really build on the wisdom we all bring to that conversation. I also think that in the face of these things that are very challenging, but also in some cases very troubling, we need to, I think, be curious enough to allow for the exploration to happen. I think if we rush to judgment all too quickly, we're going to miss out on not only the opportunity to see what is possible, but we might see one problem and focus on that and be missing a whole different set of problems that we never even thought possible, and therefore blind ourselves to the real social consequences and the real impact these things have. So I think we've got to be at least open-minded enough to allow for the engagement and let us learn from that process, as opposed to go in with a set of preconceived notions about what this all must mean.
Well, it feels like there's so many problems that we could discuss along that spectrum of possibility, and I hope, David, that this is the first of many discussions probing the possibilities for what the future of both animal, environmental, robot rights could look like. And on that note, I just want to thank you for being a guest on the Futures podcast.
Thank you for having me, and you're right, there's a lot that we could say about this, so maybe we do a sequel, so I look forward to it.
Thank you to David for showing us new ways to think about our relationship with alien intelligences. You can find out more by purchasing his book, Robot Rights, and his forthcoming book, Person Thing Robot, which will be available later this year from MIT Press. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram @Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.